The three most important characteristics of an Academy cadet is a cadet that is focused on the vision of protecting the United States of America. They view that it is something that is worth their all in all. Probably something else is that they need to have confidence, knowing that what they start, they can complete. And then probably the third is that they need to be teachable. They need to be able to take inputs from other people. And I would say that if they have those three characteristics, they're on the road to being very successful as a cadet at the Air Force Academy, and then later as an officer in the United States Air Force. I think two of the scariest moments when I was testing the B-2, the first one was shortly after I'd showed up, and as with all airplanes, especially airplanes that have ejection seats, you're going through life support training, and the young captain had just finished giving me a briefing about the ejection seat on the airplane and egress, or how to get out of it in case there's a problem. And I remember looking up at him and with a furrowed brow, and he goes, "Sir," he goes, "What's wrong, sir?" And I go, "I can never eject out of this airplane." He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "This airplane cost $1.98 billion, and our test birds were about $4 billion a piece." And I said, "If I eject out of it, I don't know what I would say to Congress as I would be sitting there across from them as to why I just ejected out of a $4 billion airplane." So that was probably the scariest moment, and it was more of a moment of realizing the responsibility that I had in terms of the fact that this was a $24 billion test program, and that we were about to enter the most intensive flight test period of the program. So we're going to be flying a lot. I think one of the other scary moments, and this was later in the program, and of course, outside I looked very, very calm, but in the inside, I was evaluating things. There was a time when we had a software drop, and what that means is we had an update to the software of the airplane. And I remember my chief engineer talking to me about the drop and talking about some of the unique intricacies of the drop. And the bottom line of it is that we needed to fly the next day. And let's just say that there was some question about what would happen with the drop. So we had a pretty in-depth discussion, and I had to sign to approve the airplanes to fly. Every time we flew, there were 3 signatures that went on authorizing that flight. Mine was the first one, and then there was my boss, the Combined Task Force Director's signature, and then also the gentleman who was in charge of Northrop at the time, who was a counterpart to the CTF director. And it would always start with me because they didn't want to see it, and they didn't want to see the authorization to fly until they knew that I agreed that it was time to fly. So getting back to the discussion between the engineer and I remember that in the final analysis, I looked at him and I said, "Do you think it's going to work?" And he said, "I think it's going to work." So I immediately took the piece of paper and I signed it. And I bring that up because this was further in the program when we basically had gotten used to each other. Yes, I was the commander, but prior to that, I was the operations officer. So I knew all of the principals in the program who were making the test flights work. But at this point in time, I was now the commander, and I was in a position of making the decisions, not just giving input to the former commander who was my boss. So now I'm the commander and I have to make these inputs, So I made the input, and I remember that when the plane flew the next day, at the back of my head all day, I was wondering how things were going. I would check in every now and then with the control room to see how things went. And I was very happy when the pilots landed safely and the airplane was intact, and I realized that we had made the correct decision. So that was probably the second time that in the program that I had some angst about what might have happened that day. But those are the responsibilities that I had as a commander, and that is why the Air Force placed their trust in me to be the commander, because they expected me to make the right decisions. And evidently it was the right one. I was thinking about advanced technology and different things that I was interested in. And a former engineer, or I should say an engineer who was a former employee of the Air Force who worked for me at the B-2, sent me a book by the title of Engines of Creation, and it was by K. Eric Drexler. Now, I had heard of nanotechnology at the time, but this was the first time that I had read about nanotechnology in depth. And this book is a primer on what nanotechnology is. And I like to read, and I'm a science fiction guy. But when I started reading this book, it was amazing. I couldn't put it down. And so my friend, Brian Martinez, who had sent me the book, wanted to introduce me to nanotechnology and to educate me as to where this particular technology was going. And what I discovered in the nanotechnology book is that I was convinced that this would be manufacturing of the future. This is the method by which we would manufacture in the future. So that stayed in the back of my mind. And the next thing that happened was that I was reading a USA Today newspaper about a company called Given Imaging. They're an Israeli company, and they had placed a camera in a pill that a person swallows, and it would image the small intestine. So the pill was sized for the small intestine, but when it got into the large intestine, it would tumble. And in the article, I talked about how Given was very interested in being able to not just image the small intestine, but the large intestine. And the reason that this was a technology that would be very interesting is that you would no longer need a colonoscope basically to get into the intestine, or some other methods, possibly an endoscope, to get into the intestine. And basically the small intestine was kind of hard to get to. The large intestine was a little bit easier to get into. But with Given Imaging's pill, these areas would be available for the doctor to be able to see without having to use a scope to get to them. So that was a motivation for the pill. At the Air Force Academy, I was a controls engineer, which basically means that we studied the methods and the science behind stabilizing rocket motors that would be gimbaled so that you could precisely control the rockets to get into space. And it was built on what we call feedback control theory, which is an area of electrical engineering that electrical engineers who are in control theory understand that. But it controls things. It controls rockets. It would also help designers figure out how to solve end solutions for perhaps an air-to-air gun that's trying to hit a target, or an air-to-air missile that's trying to hit a target. So all of that uses the science of feedback control theory. So being a controls engineer, when I read this article, I said, I bet I could stabilize that pill. And that was actually the genesis of what started me thinking about what I might do in advanced technology. And what it eventually resulted in was the startup of a company I ran for 11 years, Synerbotics, and our goal was to be the company of choice for people to put sensors that they wanted to get into the body non or minimally invasively, meaning instead of using surgery to get it into the body, that someone would swallow a pill or perhaps something would be injected. And so the first project that we wanted to work on was stabilizing given imaging's pill. And that was the genesis of what made me want to start up my own company. So I got involved with the Reno air races in a rather interesting way. We had moved to Reno and I was in my new city here and enjoying it. And I decided that since I was in Reno, I needed to go to the Reno air races. I'd heard a lot about it and had never been there. So I went to my first Reno air race. And when walking around, my eyes met the eyes of another gentleman. And I looked at him and I said, "I know you." And he goes, "I know you." And in a few seconds, we realized that we were classmates from the Air Force Academy. I had run into my classmate, Kevin Roll, that I hadn't seen for several years. And it turned out that he raced jets in the Reno air races. So he invited me over to the jet tent where all the racers or competitors who race jets would hang out. And in the Reno air races, there are classes of airplanes, and the jet class was its own class. So I went over there and started meeting the other pilots, and pretty soon I ran into a gentleman by the name of Rick Vandam. And after a while, I realized that Rick was also a graduate from the Air Force Academy, although many years before me. And he asked if I knew who Dave Vandam was, who was his brother. As it turned out, Dave Vandam was in my squadron, 21st Squadron at the Air Force Academy, and we knew each other. And so all of a sudden, I realized that I had an instant family, and I would soon find out that there were over 7 of my classmates from the Air Force Academy that lived here in the Reno area. So I was very, very comfortable and learned a lot about what the jet racers were doing, and then eventually I found out about other classes in the air races, such classes as the T6 class, other classes as the F1 class, and there were several other classes at the air races. So what happened was a few months after I had met Rick Vandam, he called me up and he said, "The air races is looking for an air boss. Would you be interested in doing that job?" And here I am, the test pilot, and I go, "It's aviation. I can do that job." I had no idea what the air boss at the air races did. So I said, sure, they could interview me, and you have to be careful what you ask for. But they interviewed me, and pretty soon I found myself understudying the current air boss, who was Shifty, or Greg Shifty Pierce, and I understudied him. And of course, there's a lot of rivalry there because he was a Navy guy and I was an Air Force guy. We had our very collegial jousting back and forth. But Shifty was extremely capable, had been the air boss for over 11 years, and I learned a lot from him. So understudying him for 2 years, then I became the air boss, and Shifty moved on, which he needed to move on because he had been the air boss for a while. But that's what got me involved in being the air boss for the Reno air races. And then I began to be a very busy individual, because essentially the air boss is the person that's responsible for flight operations at the air races, make sure that the schedule works right. And the air races is actually an air race with an air show interspersed. So you have the races that go on with each of the classes, but you also have performers that come in to do acrobatics, air acrobatics and different things. So that's how I got involved with the air races, and I learned a lot because I did not know much about civilian racing in airplanes. Probably my fondest moment at the air races is that it's what we would call the September family, where people from all over the world will come to Reno, Nevada, and they would come together for this time for the air races, this week that they would come together. And one of my fondest times was meeting individuals who had been Tuskegee Airmen, or I should say who were Tuskegee Airmen. And I would say had been, because the Tuskegee Airmen are not flying as a unit anymore, but these were the World War II black aviators that were the first pilots in the United States Air Force who were black that flew. And that was a very high point. And this was kind of a completion of a high point that I had had, because before I left the Air Force, I was down in Montgomery, Alabama, going through Air Command and Staff College, and we have an event there during the Staff College called the Gathering of Eagles. And during the Gathering of Eagles, the Air Force intends to get people who have flown in every conflict that there has ever been. So they try to get the earliest folks that have flown through to the most recent folks that have flown. And so we actually had folks all the way back to World War II. We didn't quite have anybody at World War I. But for the Eagles that would come, the different people that would come, we had Buzz Anderson, we had folks that had flown in Desert Storm. We had probably one of the most interesting test pilots in the whole world, Chuck Yeager, the man who broke the sound barrier. So we had those types of folks as Eagles. But I had the privilege of escorting Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. And that was a high point in my life. I had read his book, An American, and had read about the challenges that they had in terms of being the first black unit of pilots in the Air Force and essentially integrating air operations. But it was a high point to talk to him personally. And it was interesting because he reminded me a lot of my father, who was deceased by this time, with his mannerisms and everything. So fast forward now to the Reno Air Races, I got to meet some of the other Tuskegee Airmen, and it was wonderful meeting them. So I enjoyed that. I think probably the second thing that I really enjoyed about the air races is that there were a lot of young people that were very eager about aviation. And there were a lot of innovations that had come out of the air races in the past. Certain things that dealt with carburetors and how you get more efficiency out of these engines. And to see the young people who were very interested, and I had an opportunity where one of the professors from the University of Nevada here, called UNR, had brought his engineering class up to the tower, because the air boss sat up in the tower during the air races so that I could get a bird's eye view of what was going on and stay on top of what was going on. And he brought members of his class up there, and it was just wonderful seeing their big bright eyes as they saw the airplanes flying, and they could kind of relate to what they were learning in the classroom to a piece of hardware, things that were actually flying through the air. And I think that that's what's important, because the young folks need to dream. That's how we go forward. So high points, meeting Tuskegee Airmen, and then seeing the young folks be very interested in aviation, because they're our future. I love the Reno Air Races. We are gonna miss them. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you get a chance to read my new book, American Values. And please sign up for my newsletter, The American Grand Strategy.